Hi, I'm Danny Poulos with the Elite Lending Team at Femby. Welcome to Real Estate Insiders. And we're going to be joined today by Kevin Spina from Kai's Real Estate, and he's going to teach you a lot of things you probably don't know about buying and selling in today's market. Hi, thanks for joining us on Real Estate Insiders this week. I'm Danny Poulos from the Elite Lending Team at Femby, and we're here today with Kevin Spina from Kai's Real Estate, and he's an expert on a lot of things that we're going to get to today. So first, Kevin, take a minute, tell everybody who you are and how long you've been doing what you're doing.
Okay. I've been in the real estate business about 11 years. I work with a company called Kai's Real Estate, a Florida chain or Florida company. I'm out of the Palm Beach Gardens area. I've got administrative staff and 5 agents that work on my team, and we basically specialize in residential real estate.
Oh, that's perfect, because that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're really going to get to, first thing, some nuances about the two different types of contracts being used in a real estate offer. We're going to compare the as-is contracts to the regular FAR contract, and the way they get used really changes with the market too, and Kevin's an expert on this, so he's going to tell us from the buying side and the selling side the differences in using the two contracts. So first, if you could just tell us the basics of how an as-is contract works.
Okay, the as-is contract is basically a contract that enables the buyer to purchase a property as is. The seller's not obligated to do any repairs. The sole decision is in the buyer's hands. He'll do an inspection. He will look at the inspection report, decide if he wants to purchase, negotiate, or exit the contract.
What type of things would he be looking for in that inspection?
With the as-is contract, he's going to be looking for items like the appliances, the roof, the interior of the property. The other items would be the wood-destroying organisms in the contract. And then the last thing would be the open permits in the contract. Okay,
so going in, the buyer really knows what he's going to be looking for during that inspection period. Now, something really important that we went over quickly. So the buyer and seller, they've agreed on a price. Then they've agreed on an inspection period of about how long?
The default inspection period in an as-is contract is 15 days. You can either strengthen it to make the seller feel more comfortable by shortening that inspection period. Anywhere from 7 to 10 days, 12 days is more appealing to most sellers.
Right.
And then during that period, the buyer has that sole right to inspect the property and negotiate.
Okay, so we've agreed at $200,000, and we've set up 15 days I can inspect, so we sign the contract. I go order any kind of inspections I want within that 15 days, and then I may come up with some figures for cost to fix things I found wrong.
In the as-is.
So maybe there are termites in the house.
Yeah, say we have termites in the house, we can get a termite bond on the property. We can negotiate on appliances not working, electrical outlets not working, if there's shutters, not shutters.
Right, but there's really nothing that's off the table.
No.
Anything I find that I say, well, I'm not happy with this or this, the way you've explained it to me is we can either negotiate. At that point, I have a right to negotiate, right?
With the as-is contract, basically the buyer has the upper hand.
Right.
With the FAR contract or the standard contract, if it doesn't have an as-is rider, it gives the seller the right to have repair items listed where he's allocated to make repairs.
But just to finish on that as-is contract, so that period is over. Now I decide either negotiate. Or I could just walk. For what reason can I walk? What's acceptable?
Well, with an as-is contract, you can walk before you inspect the property. You can walk during the inspection, or you can walk due to the fact that there's deficiencies in the property. Let's say that the house doesn't have circuits, it has fuses,
right,
and you're not comfortable with electrical. You would either ask the seller to put in a new electrical panel for $1,700, $2,200, and if he opted not to do that, you could say, I'm exiting the contract.
Right, but the point is you can really leave for any reason.
Any reason.
Okay, because we're going to get back to how it differs between the buyer and the seller using that as is. So what I want everyone to understand is, on that first contract, after your inspection, Take it or leave it, you can do what you want as the buyer.
There's no obligation to purchase under an as-is.
Okay, so now we look at the standard contract.
Standard contract. And the standard contract basically has a couple different things in it. One, on a seller's side, on a listing side, the contract allocates 3 default boxes. So if the contract price is $500,000, the seller is obligating to either make repairs for 1.5% of the purchase price,
right,
or a dollar amount that he's comfortable with. He can put in $3,000. So therefore, if you get an inspection report and you have to provide the seller the inspection report, and it says you've got 2 GFI outlets that aren't functioning outside, your microwave doesn't work, or your pool heater's not functional, he would be obligated to fix those as long as they fell within the dollar amount allocated.
Right, so it's decided as part of the negotiating what's the most that the seller will pay to make repairs, and he's also obligated to make repairs. So you still have a contract.
Correct.
And the other things, I know you told me, you said the repair limit, and then there's...
And then we have the...
wood-destroying organisms for 1.5%?
The WDO, the wood-destroying organisms, for 1.5%, and then the permit section, any open permits that the buyer would find before closing, the seller would be obligated to close those permits and pay for those permits to be closed out.
Right, so it sounds like the seller's a little more bound to fix certain things.
The seller's more bound, but the buyer has a lot more problems getting out of the contract.
That's right.
So as a listing agent, again, most sellers want to see as is, I'm not fixing anything. At the same time, there's a lot of holding together the deal with a standard contract.
So with the as-is contract, you told me that most sellers, their natural reaction is saying, oh, I'm selling it as is, I'm not fixing nothing. Right? But that may not be the best way to even make the most money on their house.
Well, a couple things. Most buyers are going to negotiate during the as-is. They're going to come back and say, I did an inspection, you know what, I like your house, but I want this, this, and this fixed. And roofs, electric, appliances, air conditionings, those are things people want fixed. So with an as-is or a standard, most sellers are going to have to make repairs.
Right. And
why not?
And it's really, it sounds like the buyer has the axe on the as-is, because they're telling you how much you have to fix for them to stay in this contract. So you as a realtor, you're trying to keep the deal together, getting that, negotiating on that number. So back to that seller that comes to you and says, Kevin, I want you to sell my house and I want to sell it as is. What's the advice you would want to give them at that point?
Again, if I'm going into a listing with an as-is seller, I'm going to tell them that more than likely we're going to negotiate. Secondly, if we're going in that way, we're going to go ahead and run through your property with a light inspection, and we're going to look at things that we know will be a problem.
So you'll know ahead of time.
Right. I tell people, I walk through people's house, the first thing you want to look at is ceilings. Do I see any spots or leaks? Well, if I see a wet spot in a laundry room, I'm going to get a roofer in there to make the repair. We'll disclose it on the seller's disclosure, but we're eliminating the problem during the inspection. Right.
Now, that same seller, if you could talk him into a standard contract, how would you work out these limits? So
depending on the sale price of the home, 1.5% is a lofty number.
Right.
The biggest thing in those 3 items is the typical repairs. The open permits, we can spend $35 running an open permit search and come back to the seller and say, you don't have any open permits. So that becomes sort of a false number.
Right.
The WDO, a lot of people have termite bonds, or we can, for $50, get a guy to come in and inspect the property, and if it does have issues, address it before we list it, put a bond on the property, and then offer it as a selling item. This property has been termite inspected and bonded. People like warranties. And then we're only really dealing with, if we go to sell, the balance of the repairs.
All right, well then let's say you've convinced your seller that he might be better off using a standard FAR contract, based on just what you've said now, using a standard FAR contract, coming up with maximums that he will spend. The purpose being that after the buyer does their inspection, They can't just walk out the door for no reason.
Right.
They're locked in.
Right.
To if you fix what you said you would fix up to that limit,
Correct.
then you're in a different place. So let's talk about the seller that's agreed to accept FAR offers, and now these as-is offers are coming in from buyers. What kind of red flag does that put up for you as the listing agent if you're seeing buyers come in with as-is offers?
Yeah, I mean, the as-is is the predominant contract. So what you want to do is make sure the as-is sticks together. Understanding that the buyer has the right to exit. So representing mainly listing clients, and then we do deal with a lot of buyers, we'll use that contract to make multiple offers on the buy side.
Right, so yeah, that's what I'm getting at. So
Right.
we're talking about it's different if you're the buyer and the seller.
Exactly.
So if you're working with the seller and a bunch of offers come in, you've got 3 or 4 offers to consider, you're trying to figure out which is highest and best. You told me that sometimes if someone gives you an as-is contract, that might not be the only as-is offer they have floating out there.
Correct.
So what is that strategy for some buyers?
The strategy for the buyers would be, let's say they are in a development in Nabucoa and they're looking at 3 homes.
Right.
And the homes range from $500,000 to $800,000, and they can afford $650,000, and they like one better than the other, but they don't think they can afford it.
Right.
As a buyer's agent, we would say, look, you can make an offer on 2 properties. We'll come in slightly below what we think they'll sell at, or you can come in, substantially lower and just see how they respond. And then at that point, we will see buyers sometimes with the low rates right now step up to the higher priced property, because I didn't think I could get that $700,000 property for $660,000, $640,000, $630,000. And now on the second contract, because it's an as-is, they have the right to exit the contract without inspecting, without spending any money. It upsets the other agent, but again, when you're working for that buyer, your obligations are to get the buyer the best deal on the home they want at the price they want.
Right. So it's all sort of opposite what you'd think. I mean, naturally, like you had said, the seller says, well, I want to sell it as is, I know what I want. And what he's really doing is maybe empowering the buyer, who can put in offers on anything he wants and know he can walk on anything he wants.
I mean, I think sellers don't, and again, educating your seller on what to expect. People think, well, when I get a contract, they got to buy it, and if they don't buy it, I keep their money. It doesn't work that way. There are contingencies in the contract, and what you want to do is keep a deal together. So the more education and knowledge you provide the seller, the more they feel comfortable getting in a better contract sometimes.
Right. And lastly, when you were going over the 3 things that you might have to cure, the last one was open permits. And I've heard you talk about things that I never heard before about how you can handle open permits. I thought that you couldn't get title and close a deal when permits were open, but you're telling me that's not the case.
Not the case. Since we've had the bank-owned properties and the short sales, title companies are now doing open permit searches. So a property can close with an open permit in place.
Right.
A title company can transfer clear title with an open permit. So in the as-is contract, the open permit section of the contract is good through the inspection period. If an open permit is there and not discovered during the inspection period, it becomes the buyer's sole responsibility financially to close it out. The seller only has to cooperate with signing papers and providing documentation, whereas the standard contract keeps that open permit clause open during the entire process, contingency past the inspection, past the financing, and up to closing 5 days before the close.
So if you're representing the buyer, how do you protect them against having that expense fall upon them?
Right. So in an as-is contract, you would do a open permit search during the inspection period for $35. Secondly, you would add a clause in the addenda section that says that the seller agrees at the seller's sole expense to handle any and all open permits between the time of effective date and closing. So you've added the same items in the standard contract back into the as-is. Now, if you don't know that and you don't get that in there, you could be sitting at closing and be presented with an affidavit to sign and still be obligated contractually to close with an open pool permit, an open fence permit, a roof permit, and a lot of times these additions are done without permits. You got enclosures on back of houses done without permitting, and you as the buyer in an as-is have now accepted all those open permits.
Well, and then you're saying that this is pretty much, because years ago, we've both been doing this a long time. Years ago, we never ran into this that much. So you're saying now a lot of it has to do with the fact that houses are foreclosures and short sales and just things weren't handled properly.
Well, I think
they didn't let permits open.
Right. I think a lot of the open permits are basically just lack of follow-through between the building departments and contractors. We're seeing that, yeah, they have a permit, they were inspected, but there was never a final or a closeout.
Gotcha.
So that's the part that we see. Permit, yes, or sometimes no permit at all. The work was just done without a permit.
Right.
But the banks, being that, the market has changed with short sale and REO foreclosures, the banks have taken upon themselves to disclose as much as possible to the purchaser of these properties and saying, we're telling you that there are open permits on this property.
The more you explain all this stuff about the nuances and intricacies of contracts now, and a lot of it has to do with the type of market it is, I could just think that one person I wouldn't want to be right now, and that's a seller not working with a realtor, just trying to sell my own house and trying to navigate through this. Well, forget about that. Even a buyer. I mean, if you have a buyer and a seller and no agents involved, how do you navigate through this stuff? I mean, it's just crazy.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem. I mean, in any, people want medical treatment, they go to a doctor. We're professionals, the guys that are in the business, that know the business, are saving the buyers and the seller.
Right.
In most cases, more than the commission.
Yeah, it could not become more obvious when we run through things like this. That's great stuff. We're going to take a break for a minute, and we'll be right back on Real Estate Insiders.